All right. Well, welcome in everybody to the origin of Time for Forgiveness. This is our first inaugural podcast in this series, and we're so excited to be with you. My name is Robert Pascuzzi, and I'm co-hosted here by Kelly Pascuzzi and Father Don Farnan. Welcome in, everyone.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, Father Don Farnan. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Kansas City and St. Joseph in Missouri in the heartland, and glad to be here with you. Thank you.
We are so thrilled to have you as a part of this podcast, and we're going to get into the origin of this podcast in a minute. Before we do, I can't leave out my beautiful wife, Kelly. Kelly, it's so welcome, so exciting to do this with you, and welcome in.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be a part of this and to see where this takes all of us.
All right. Well, audience, we want to give you a little origin background here and just bring you up to speed on how Time for Forgiveness really got started. And I think it goes back to just a journey that my wife, Kelly, and I have been on for the last 10 plus years. And this all centered around the Ravine, first in the novel and then moving to the film. So what transpired out of a very horrific personal event for us was moving through a tragedy that caused us to have to think in a new way and ask some different questions. And one of the things we had to ask is, could we forgive? Really at the time when this event happened, in our minds, I think, was the unforgivable almost. And just the emotion of anger and resentment, some of the really empowering things that we had to move through. First of all, to let that go and eventually be able to move on to forgiveness. Because as we know, Father, and you can speak about this, when we hold on to negative emotions, the one who really suffers, it's not the person that we're holding the emotion on, it's ourselves. So we become, as Joanna said in the movie, we almost become a prisoner to our own emotions.
Yeah, you know what comes to mind first of all is Moby Dick. That sounds like a weird place to start, but Herman Melville, who wrote that novel, spoke about the purpose of writing it. You remember Captain Ahab in the beginning gets his leg cut off by this whale. Mm-hmm. And so he's running around with a peg leg, and he spends his whole rest of his life obsessed with anger because of what has happened to him. And so the rest of the book is all about pursuing this anger and all manifest upon the whale. And the story ends, of course, when he finally reaches up to the whale and he harpoons it. And the harpoon is connected to the rope, and the rope is connected to him, to his leg, mm-hmm. the very leg that was bitten off. And he is pulled into the ocean, and he dies there on top of the whale. And Melville was asked, why did you write that? And he said, because unless we forgive, it's going to drive us mad. And unless we forgive, it's going to kill us. Mm-hmm. So forgiveness is always on the part of the one who is just enraged by this sense. And unless we can let go of that, it's going to be awfully tough to live a healthy, holy, wholesome life.
And, you know, we came together on this idea, audience, because of the overwhelming response to our film and the message in the film of overriding message of forgiveness. And we thought we should just expound on this topic of radical forgiveness and what does that really mean and what does that look like and how do you move through that. So what we want to bring to you on a weekly basis are these podcast sessions where we're going to be going deep into some of these subjects, and at the same time we'll be taking questions. So you're going to have an opportunity to text in or email in your questions, and we'll take some of those questions on each one of our sessions here so you can feel like you have a chance to interact with us individually. And so we're really excited to roll into this. And Kelly, do you have any thoughts that you want to share on, you know, the motivation behind Time for Forgiveness?
Well, I believe that forgiveness is such an important thing because we can become stuck in the acceptance that this is what it is, and it's the best it'll ever be moving forward. But as we begin to reevaluate and look from a different lens or a perspective, what we look at changes. And Father Don had said, forgiveness is to let go, but it's to abandon completely. And I believe, you know, it sounds so easy, right? But it's so difficult to do because you have to almost in some way invite the experience again to move through it. And so I guess I want to start just by asking, what does that look like in regards to, it's not moving from it, it's moving through it, but you have to invite something that, I believe you get invited to something inside of you that you weren't even aware that was there for you to be able to move through the strength of forgiveness.
I think so. Often we'll hear, gosh, we need to get over that. We need to move beyond that. Well, to move beyond it, we don't usually just get over it. As you say, Kelly, we need to go through it. And going through it, I think, is kind of like that dark cave that sometimes we go through to get from the here to the there. And there's no other way to get there on the map except to go through the cave. It'd be nice if there were a different way, but that's the only route that we have. And so while we're in the darkness and every direction that we see is just more darkness, then we're given a choice. And it's the old fight or flight thing. We can either crumble up in a fetal position and not do anything, or we can grope around in that darkness and try to feel our way until perhaps out of the corner of our eye and the peripheral vision somewhere, we're going to find some little flicker of a flame of a hope or something. And that will be enough to keep us moving to get through it. Because I think you're absolutely right. We've got to go beyond it, but we can't just get over it. It's going to be going through it, and the going through it is sometimes dark, and that means we have to revisit the pain. But that's the only way to get there, I think.
Yeah, and Kelly, can you speak to this, because Father Farnon's hitting on a very important topic here. When this initial event that we experienced happened, there was a period, as Father Don's alluding to here, that you, in your situation, that you really had to move through, moving from a very difficult space and a time where you weren't readily available or willing to give forgiveness to Danny. And then how did that evolve over time, and how did you end up working through that piece? Because I think it's the starting point for everybody, right? We all react differently to it, and we all go through different events in our life and challenges, but we're all dealing with it on one level or another. And in your situation, because I witnessed it, and I have, I witnessed how you moved through that over time, and it was very challenging. But how did you feel that you eventually worked your way through that?
Well, obviously it took some time, a lot of time for me. But if I look back, I think the breakthrough moment was just an understanding that I couldn't change the events. While I would have loved to have, but I was never going to be able to change the events, but I could always change the meaning I attached to them. And to do that, I had to go to work inside and start being open to moving through this thing. And that's a whole nother piece when we're talking about loss and grief, and then you're adding the idea of forgiving that. I think that's why I'm so interested in these conversations that we're going to be having, because it's so different for everyone. The experience is different, and there's no magic process. I think what I was asked to move through, I really didn't invite anybody to be on that journey with me. I thought I could just do it alone, and that was a really difficult place to be. And so that's one of the things that I hope in this conversation about forgiveness is an understanding that you don't have to do it alone. And I love the word that you said, hope. There was a flicker of it. And I think that's really what forgiveness gives is an idea, this thing that it could be better.
And I suspect it's something that every human person could relate to. And there are such levels to that. It may not be homicide and suicide and the death of loved ones and a child that is killed, but it might be something bad at work, a difficult boss or a tough situation. But whatever it is, every human person, I think, can relate to this. Something that just seems not right, and we hold on to it, and it hurts us personally, and so we can't forgive, or we're stuck in something that we know that we need to move beyond to that sense of forgiveness. So I do believe that it's something that anybody who listens can say, I can relate to that on some level. It may not be as intense as somebody else's, but it's something that's real.
Well, Father, how do you respond to the listener who's is hearing this, but maybe thinking to themselves, well, you don't understand what I've been through, or you don't understand, the pain and the difficulty and this, and so they're holding on to this again. It's this thing they're holding on against this person, and they've made it so, real, and they personalized it where they feel like they can't get through it, and maybe no one else understands it. They're the only ones going through this.
I would say to them, you're absolutely right. I cannot understand what you are going through. I do not understand what you're going through. No one can live what someone else lives through. I do think that there are some guidelines that we are given through some people who have had the experience. And I'm thinking particularly of, do you remember Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief? And she was talking about the death and dying process, but was also talking about other things like forgiveness. And the ultimate goal, and she had about 5 different steps, and the last one was acceptance. We all need to get to a place where we can accept and essentially to move on, but most of us will start in other places. The usual first step is denial. I do not believe this. This could not have happened. This is not the way it should be, and it's something is not right. And then we move to other stages like
we definitely
anger.
experienced that.
Yeah. And you probably have the anger stage and the bargaining stage and the other stages, depression that seeps in, anxieties that do. But I think overall, there are professionals and people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who have had the experience and have studied so many people who have gone through difficult things that there are steps. It may not be in the same order for everyone, but I think we go from the initial shock, hurt, pain, that we do not want to face it, we cannot face it, and so we want to deny it, to eventually getting to a place where we can decide to get up every morning, put on our clothes, go out and do something, because there's a world out there that wants us to live in it, and we need to live in it. So that stage of acceptance is where we all seek to get and to become better people because of it.
When somebody comes to see you and they're seeking your advice and they're stuck, let's say, and they're saying to you, nobody understands what I'm going through and the magnitude of what this person or this event has caused in my life, and I'm just not able to move through it. What do you tell them to help them initially start to move through it? What would be your advice?
Well, I think that the first thing, usually, and every case is different, but is just to try to accept that person where that person happens to be at that time, and to commit to be a companion to them for whatever is the next step.
Now, that's a big ask, isn't it? Sometimes, I'm sure you have people that look at you and say, "Father, you don't understand. You don't get it."
Absolutely right.
Right.
This may not be a good example. Remember the old movie about What About Bob, or Where is Bob, or whatever, this psychologist, and he wrote the book called Baby Steps. Everything is baby steps. We've got to just accept where we are and then take one tiny step, because that is what we need to do to move out of the place where we are that is not a good place. Mm-hmm. It's challenging. But if we accept people where they are, acknowledge that we cannot know what they are going through, and to accompany them. And again, I always think of Jesus Christ, because that was his mode of operation, is to accompany people, to take them somewhere that is a better spot.
I'm reading from the book Working with the Law. It's a fascinating book by Raymond Hollywell, and on one of the chapters, it's the law of forgiveness. He says, we need to understand that if you forgive sin, the effect of such an act of forgiveness would become absorbed with the natural and healthy ideas, much the same as the blackest of night is absorbed with the dawn of light. The blackness disappears and the light of day shines upon all. So I think that's the clothing of the mind and allowing this to move out, and then just by natural the process of moving that out, the darkness, the light then takes over. He goes on to say the originating place of every act is in the mind. So we must take conscious control of our thoughts and the emotions around those thoughts, because those emotions are holding us in captivity. They're keeping us bound. And so ultimately the only one who's suffering is ourselves.
Right. Gosh, Robert, there are just so many emotions that people have to play with. That gamut of emotions that goes through our minds in difficult times, and often we don't even know how we are feeling. You know, with little children, and I've worked in grade schools through most of my priesthood, you know, we always start when kids come to the principal's office, or when a kid's in a tough situation, or a kid is crying, or whatever it is. We ask the child, how do you feel? And then we give them the four major feelings. Are you sad? Are you glad? Are you happy? Are you mad? Are you angry? Or are you afraid? And usually those four feelings, we can begin to have a conversation and to move a little bit with it. I think it's such a tough thing to know how we feel. So emotions are tough enough for adults, but certainly for little ones. I suspect that some of these emotions are some of them are mental issues that we may not be able to handle on our own. So you think of depressions and anxieties. Now, they're the normal types of depression and anxieties that people can work through. But if it's a psychological depression, we can't work through that on our own. We're going to need some help and some assistance for that depth of an emotion. With anger, I think anger might be the best one to talk about, because it is the one that every human person deals with. Jesus himself got angry. Mm-hmm. Jesus, who was sinless, and you know, anger is listed as one of the cardinal sins. How can the sinless one sin? Well, anger's not a sin. At its core, it's merely an emotion. It's neither good nor bad by its very definition. But anger can run out of control, and it can get the best of us. Sometimes we will need professional assistance to go beyond that emotion. But many times, I think we can help one another as companions, whether it's friendship companions or spiritual companions or companions in faith, to get to a better place. You know, the word anger comes from a Norse word, which translates into English as grief. Mm-hmm. There are things that we grieve. We ought to grieve them. Right. There are things that we're angry about, and there are things that we should be angry about. And sometimes if we're not angry about certain things, I would think that is more sinful.
But if we hold on to the emotion of anger, it can become very destructive.
Absolutely.
If we're not processing it the right way. Would you agree?
I would. Kelly, what do you think? I mean, this whole notion of anger, it's a tough one, isn't it?
Obviously, when you are experiencing loss and you're in the grieving process, anger is a big emotion, but I think mine flipped very quickly from anger to guilt. And I stayed there for quite some time, which was not a fun place to be. And it wasn't a very positive place for me to be, but just the guilt of all the things that you think if you would have said, done, things would be different.
I think it's so important for us to let people know that it's okay. Wherever they happen to be, it's okay. If you don't follow the certain order of steps of moving from the initial shock and denial to getting to acceptance, it's okay. If we step backwards, it's like our friend Bruce Springsteen and taking one step forward and two steps back. We don't always go in a straight line, do we? Yeah. There's a lot of spiraling forward and backwards to get to where it is that we want to go. And I think that's just part of it. So you take something like guilt and say, oh my God, is there something I could have done? How did I not see this? How did I not know? Mm-hmm. How could I be so stupid? But we cannot take the responsibility. We can't know more than we know, and we can only know of a person that which they choose to reveal to us. Mm-hmm. And we can't enter into something that's deeper if it's not revealed.
Right. And I can relate to what you're saying, Father, because when this event that is depicted in the Ravine happened, that was where I initially went. My mind went to is how did this happen? The Danny that I knew, I couldn't conceptualize or wrap my mind around how this was able to happen. How did this happen? But I think the important thing is that if we shut down and emotionally and we push people out, and we judge the event or the circumstances, then we have no ability to change the meaning or impact it in a positive way. And as Hollywell says in his book here, everyone must at some time walk the path of forgiveness. We must learn to live this law. It must be important. Only as we forgive are we forgiven. What are your thoughts of that? Do you think everyone's going to walk the path of forgiveness, Father? We already know the answer, but I want you to expound on that.
No, I don't think that everyone can walk the path of forgiveness. I think everyone is given the opportunity, and everyone has the capability, everyone has the capacity, and everyone has the God-given grace to do that, but it has to be a choice. And I don't know that everyone has the capacity to choose that. Does that make sense?
It does. Can you give a real life experience? I mean, you've probably dealt with people on their deathbed and
Sure.
and they know they need to forgive something or somebody. It might be themselves, right? I mean, we're talking about ourselves in this thing too. What do we need to release about things that we're holding negative emotions on the behalf of how we see ourselves?
Well, I would say this. I would say, and maybe we'll get into this in another episode, but as we talk about what we are as human creatures, we are going to have certain things that define us. And one of the things that defines us is that we are social beings. That is, that we live in relationship to one another. It's not just us. It's our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to one another, our relationship to our God, our relationship to creation itself. We are creatures of the Creator, and part of our task then is to be creative and to be co-creators and to help to unfold this whole notion of forgiveness. So, as well as being social beings, we're also spiritual beings. We cannot exist without a spirituality, but that's for another episode. Just like we're all sexual beings, we cannot exist without a sexuality. We must. Now, some people say I'm asexual or I'm asocial or I don't know anything about spirituality. We all have it. It's just we're not tapped into it so much.
Yes. It's like the person who says, I'm not creative. Right. Everyone has creativity in them. They just haven't allowed it to come to the surface or maybe express it in a unique way.
Absolutely. So the Bible, so our Judeo-Christian history and our Christian scriptures are built upon our Jewish ancestry. And that theology is based on a notion of forgiveness, that as we forgive others, God will forgive us. And it's actually a conditional relationship that we're told in the Old Testament and New Testament, or the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. Unless you forgive one another, God will not forgive you. So that might be another episode also. But I think it's important for us to start there if we have this Christian or Judeo-Christian history and say, that's important to us. Jesus says, forgive. In fact, when Peter challenged and said, how many times, Lord? 7? And 7 is the number of perfection. So he said, is that the perfection? And Jesus said, not 7 times, but 70 times, 7 times. So take perfection to the 10th degree times itself. And it's not a mathematical equation to say, yeah, reach 490 and you're done. It's simply saying that if we want to be perfect, then we're going to continue to forgive. And we've got to learn to forgive ourselves, one another, and God, and our very creation. But there are people who hold on to those things, and they're so mad at God. Or like you say, some people go to their deathbed and holding on things that they have never reconciled within themselves as well.
I'm reading here, the law reads that certain ideas must be dissolved and cleared from the mind in order that other ideas or new ideas of a different character may replace them. So this is the idea of the dark, pushing out the old and allowing the new to come in, the darkness that's binding us. And he says it may be explained as a bottle that is full, already full, which must be emptied before it can be refilled or added to. So this idea of bottling up these negative emotions can be very destructive. So we all know that. But when you're counseling somebody and they're saying, "I understand that, Father. I get," and you're walking them through this. This is what's happening, and they're telling you they intellectually they understand it. That all makes sense. I mean, what I just read and what you said makes sense to most people, right? But they hold on to it. They're pushing back against you for whatever reason, right? They've got a multitude of all logical, very sound reasons why they can't move through that and forgive. How do you work with that person? What would you say to them?
Sometimes I don't work with it all that well, Robert, but I try to do my best just to accept people where they are and to know that even if they can accept something intellectually, they may not be able to accept it emotionally. It's even like death happens all the time. Mostly it happens to older people, but so often we see that it happens to people our age and to people our children's age and to young people. And that doesn't make as much of a sense of a way in which we are accepting things.
Well, I want to ask you a question because you just said sometimes we are to accept where others are. And do you believe that people are sent that can help others work through to see things in a different perspective? And I'm speaking about the character Joanna, because I, after those events, was trying to do it on my own, not very good in any way. And although I was asking constantly for help, and Joanna, I believe, was sent to give me the opportunity to look in a different lens or from a different perspective, because I was so locked in the idea that I wasn't going to forgive. I had so much guilt over, what happened. I was not in a good place. And I believe that was a gift. I didn't go out to seek it. It found me. And I guess in regards to, I guess you'd call it a modern day prophet. What are your thoughts there?
I have a lot of thoughts about it, and I'm not sure if they will all make sense. And I would be fascinated to hear what the listeners think and how they might respond. And they might also help us to guide a future podcast in discussing this a little bit further. This much I can start with and say that in Scripture, we know that there are other beings that are present in our physical material world. Some of those beings that I will call the spiritual beings are manifest within our friends, our neighbors, our relatives, and some of those might be more otherworldly. So I don't know how all of this happens, but in, again, our Judeo-Christian history, we hear about prophets and we hear about angels. And we hear about dreams and messages that guide us through some other forum to help us to make sense out of that which cannot make sense. Prophets are not fortune tellers. That's an important thing to know. In Scripture, prophets are spokespersons for God and the godly voice. So they bring the voice of God into our reality and into our relationships. And in addition to prophets, there are angels that we're told about, and an angel is a messenger of the divine. So I don't know if that has to be an otherworldly creature that comes and descends to be upon us, or if it might just be a reality that is placed in some people who are more tapped into a spiritual world like Joanna is. Is Joanna a modern day prophet? Could Joanna be an angel? I think on some level the answer is yes. But Is that the total definition, or is it because we are all in relationship to God, and the place where you were at that time in your life that you had nowhere to turn, you may have been more open to that reality of that voice, call it the voice of God or call it the voice of guidance through a difficulty or whatever it was, that you were open to that. Does that kind of resonate?
Open to receive.
Do you think that most people are not going to be open if they have a normal life, if they have an average life, if they have a conventional life, if their life is not rattled too much? We're just going through our existence and things seem to be okay. Does that close us off to something very valuable and important, or is it just that we don't need it and so it's okay?
Well, I believe that we reject things that we don't understand. But when you're in a state of trying to make sense of the unthinkable, you become very open and very curious. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't know. I just find it to be very fascinating that we are such interesting creatures, aren't we? Human beings are just so fascinating, and some of us are tapped into things a little bit more than others. The things of this world, I mean, we're here to exist in this world, so it's probably a great thing if people become very worldly. That's why we're here. But sometimes we entrap ourselves with the physical and the material. Other people seem to enter into the world with a sense of something else, and I'll say it's from where they come. We come from God, and they have a sense of God that taps them into a different level of existence on a spiritual world that stays with them. I'll give you two brief examples, and these are deathbed experiences. One, a man who was very successful in our world, but he was a judge. He was somebody who had kind of control and some power, but he was very tied into this world. And at his deathbed, as his family wanted him to go to confession, and he grabbed me by the collar, and he could not let go. And he said he couldn't go. He could not let. He was so afraid. He could not let go of this. Someone just so tied into this world. So there may have been a good aspect of his life that was very physical and material and successful, but I don't know if in his earthly existence he tapped into things that were beyond. That may not be the best of example, but I would say he operated more out of fear than out of love. The contrary example is someone who was also elderly. In other words, these people had full lives. But on his deathbed, a very saintly man, very humble, very thoughtful, very kind. And he's dying and he is so weak. And yet he sits up and stares out and opens up his arms and is so receptive to his dying. And it was, actually a beautiful thing, lied back down and died. And I don't know if that has anything at all to do with the choices that we make and how we live this world, or our openness to God's grace within us, or our desire to think that we can control what we can control and we don't have that openness to the other things. So I don't know what it all means, but I think human persons are all given choices. Everybody has to deal with the forgiveness, and I think everybody has to deal with anger, and I think everybody has to deal with difficult aspects in life, though they are to varying degrees. And I don't know why some are more open to it than others.
I just want to go back to what you just said, and when we're talking about this idea of forgiveness, it starts with a choice. You have to choose it. Mm-hmm. You have to be open to it.
Right. Because if we're not open to it, then we close down. And then that just blocks off any other possibility. We've got some questions coming in here, Father. I think we should probably let's pivot and answer a couple of these questions. It says there's a whole bunch of good ones here. How can I forgive someone when my church tells me a sin is unforgivable? Boy, that's a
Whoa, that is
a
tough.
lightning rod.
Yes.
All right.
My church too, the Catholic Church, does list some sins as being unforgivable sins. I'm not even sure that most Catholics are aware of that. Now, in the scriptures, it says that the unforgivable sin is essentially apostasy or heresy or denial of God, essentially, to say that God is not relevant, to push God away, in other words, to make ourselves God. It really goes back to the story of Adam and Eve and what the church calls original sin, or what psychology calls the human condition. That is, to not be satisfied with our creation, but to want more, to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life, that we are wanting to be God, not wanting to be the creature of God, the one in relationship to God. So what does our church say? And I would say that most of the Christian churches and our Judeo-Christian history would say the only real unforgivable sin has to do with that sense of denying the Holy Spirit, denying God as God because we want to be God. Now, the Catholic Church, because of its structure and its hierarchy, have certain sins that even in the confessional a priest cannot forgive. And again, I don't know that many people are aware of these, but I'll just mention a few of them. And they're probably less than 10 today. They change at different times in history. Most of them are reserved to the Pope or to bishops. So like, for example, a bishop who ordains bishops to become bishops who are not sanctioned by the church would be an unforgivable sin. That wouldn't be something that most of us would really hear about. It happened after the Second Vatican Council. That would be a recent time in the 1970s and 80s when such a thing happened. There are some sins reserved to a pope or to a bishop, and others to a priest. Like, for example, if a priest comes to me for confession and that priest is a pedophile who has committed a sin of abuse to a child, that would be something that I could not forgive. If I did forgive that would be on me. Mm-hmm. That would be an unforgivable sin. And the only ones that I can think of that would be for the people in the pews, that our listeners out there would know about, murder is one of those things that we would say is unforgivable. And the Catholic Church would include abortion in that, because abortion, we believe, is murder. It used to be left up to bishops to grant priests that ability to forgive that sin. And you may remember, or listeners may remember, that Pope Francis a few years ago gave that permission to any priest in the world. Let me put it this way. An act of voluntary murder, of taking the life of another person in a conscious state and intending that's what is intended. That is unforgivable. Now, that's the church speaking. That's not our Lord speaking. So that's a little bit different. I need to make sure people understand that. Right. The other things for the people in the pew, just real quickly, would be one is if someone takes the Blessed Sacrament and abuses that for demonic or satanic purposes, that would be an example of another unforgivable sin.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that kind of goes right into this notion of is there anything that's unforgivable? So how does somebody move through this then, if, like in our situation where one of our best friends murdered his wife? So how do we were able to find forgiveness there, and that released us, in the metaphorical sense, but also in the physical sense. But how does that relate to a listener who's saying, well, but, I go to this XYZ church and they're telling me that, I should think differently about that?
Yes, and I think this is also going to be for another podcast to get into more in detail. But I think the important thing to remember in all of this is that churches are to be vessels for one's relationship with God. So the only reason the Catholic Church exists or any other church is to help people grow closer to our Lord. We might sometimes say, think with the mind of the church. And that's a good thing to say. But I would say, let's go further than that. Let's think with the mind of Christ. Let's think with the mind of our God, even though we cannot grasp and comprehend that mind. Sometimes, and we've probably all seen this often enough, is that the mind of the church and the mind of Jesus do not line up all that well. We've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I would say, what is our notion of church, and are we using that to help us to strengthen our relationship to God, or are we stuck in something to say that the church will determine for us what is sin and what is not, because the church would be the first to say that although we offer an objective standard of morality, a definition of right and wrong, we also believe that one's well-informed conscience, the presence of Christ, or the Holy Spirit, Jesus said, I will not abandon you. I give you this gift to the Holy Spirit, the gift of love to dwell within you. We sometimes call our conscience, our inside, our instinct. A well-informed conscience is always more important than any law.
I just want to comment on something. Going back to, we said forgiveness. Do people have different capacities to forgive? And it starts with a choice to forgive. But the capacity and the choice is probably based on our conditioning and what's logical, what we've been taught. But from personal experience, you cannot prepare yourself for some of these events and how you're going to respond. But as you start moving through this and start reevaluating the meaning for you, if I would have not been able to forgive, I would be in a very different place today. And those around me would be in a very place today. And I don't believe it would have been a good place.
That's right. I think it's also important for believers or those who adhere to the Bible to remember a few things. For example, some of the primary characters that we uphold as being the ideals or the greatest emissaries of our faith would be people like Moses, St. Paul. But if you remember the story of Moses from his adult onset, the story begins with him murdering others.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's right.
And that is the person that God has chosen then, this murderer, to come and lead the people and to set the people free. St. Paul, we're told, was a persecutor of the Christians. And the first story we hear about Paul is when St. Stephen, we now call him a saint, the first martyr of the church, is being stoned to death, that the crowd there is piling their cloaks at the foot of Saul, soon to become Paul and later St. Paul. Mm-hmm. So whether he murdered Christians, and there's some debate about that, or other ways persecuted them, he was a co-conspirator at the very least in murder. He took part in that. And this is the person that was chosen in the Christian religion to be the great emissary of faith. So I think we also have to ask the question about what is redemption and how do we move through that, and is there any unforgivable sin? I think that our scripture is suggesting all sin is forgivable because with God all things are possible, that we can move to higher and better levels.
You said the word redemption, moving through it. I have an awareness now that when I experienced and moved through redemption, it's when I moved from a space of judgment to a place of understanding. And I had a very different perspective of what I was looking at.
I think one of the challenges for the Catholic Church today is that we often operate out of a place of judgment also. That a lot of the young people, young Catholics and young everybody says, I don't know if I want to be a part of a religious institution that judges and condemns. Now, we might want to caveat that a little bit and say everybody judges. We are by our nature judging because we are shaped and molded by our environment, by our nurturing, by our nature. So we come to have a sense of what is a good and right and happy and holy and healthy. And so we have a sense of that, and that which operates outside of it, we might make a judgment about, saying, I don't know if that's right. So I think we all judge. In fact, that's where we get the word prejudice, that there is a prejudgment that takes place just out of how we are shaped and molded, how we grow up, how we come to know the world. But then also, when we move from judgment to condemnation, that's pretty serious stuff, because Jesus said, and our spiritual leaders have said, that there's really only one judge. And it's not anybody of us. It's not anybody here on earth. The one judge is our God. So as Pope Francis said, who am I to judge? People said, well, you're the Pope, for God's sake. If anybody ought to be judging, it should be you. So I'm not God.
Right. Well, and the judgment comes from our perception. And we all have different perception, right? One person could look at something and say, well, that's the meaning of that act to me, but the next person could say, no, it's this. And so who's right and who's wrong? It's just simply their perception. And so I think, like Kelly had alluded to earlier, when she changed her perception of that event, then the meaning started to change at that time for her. And that's why you go back to Wayne Dyer. He said, when you change the way, Dr. Wayne Dyer, when you change the way you look at something, what you look at changes. So our perception is a higher faculty. It's something that has been gifted to us from God, just like our will is, our imagination, our intuition, our memory. These are the creative faculties that God has gifted human beings. In all other life forms, they don't have that. They go by instinct, right? They can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. We've got our little golden doodle here sitting next to us. He's been amazingly quiet through this, but he can see, smell, taste, and touch. Prince, our dog. But he doesn't have the higher faculties. And when we really, this is another topic we can get into, but when we start to understand that we do have these higher faculties that God has gifted us, and we do have the ability to change our perception and look at something. It's almost like, okay, I'm going to get up, I'm going to walk around, and I'm going to sit in your seat, Father, and I'm going to look at this situation differently. And I'm going to start asking some different questions. Questions are power, right? What else could this mean? What good could possibly come from this situation? That's how we took this very, very dark, horrific event that occurred in our life, and we started to change the meaning of it. Was it easy? No, it wasn't. But what's the alternative? Like you said, what's the alternative? Well, we all know what it is.
Well, you said when our perception changed. I think everything changed for me when my perception of myself changed, coming from the idea of my unworthiness with God to my oneness with God. I started really making different choices, and I believe it's very different. Like, the world would look different from proving ourselves to expressing ourselves.
That idea of perception is just so key, and there's a whole psychology of perception. There ought to be a spirituality and a religious sense of perception also. We can look at art, we can listen to music, we can know what we like, and instantly we do. A lot of people say, you know about a song within the first 5 beats or 3 seconds or something, whether that's a song you like or don't like. You just know these things. Almost instinctual, or maybe because of the experience.
Intuition, your intuition is telling you.
Right, You're right. So we have this sense of perception, and if we can change the perception, then we'll realize something beyond. What was Jimmy Morrison's great comment on that? This is the lead singer of The Doors. Do you remember that he took the name The Doors from William Blake and his poetry, and he says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see reality as it truly is, infinite. So, Kelly, when you're talking about that idea of perception and a relationship to God and coming to a realization that you are one with God, What a powerful thing. I mean, Jesus says to his followers, I am in you and you are in me. And then he says, I am in the Father and the Father is in me and the Father and I are one. And I am the vine and you are the branches. We are connected. And therefore we are connected to the Father. And, to get that whole sense of oneness, what a powerful, powerful thing. And if we get to that stage in our lives, it would seem to me that things begin to make a lot more sense because of perception. We're looking at things from a different viewpoint, and it's not about separation, but it is about oneness. And I would just add to that, and I'm sorry if I'm doing too much talking here, but the idea of conversation and why it is so important for us to be able to move to a different perception by conversing. And I think that our having a conversation here and people listening out there and them going to their kitchen counters and talking about having the dialogue,
Right.
it's all to move us to conversion, which is essentially to say to a different perception, to a different perspective, to
Different meaning. Yeah. Very well said, Father. Well, I think that that next question I have, I think we're going to table this one for episode 2, but I think this will help us kick right into where we're kind of at right now. One of the listeners said, "How can I forgive when I'm not religious and I don't believe in God?"
What is your understanding that they are associating the idea of forgiveness as being a religious thing and not a human thing?
I mean, that was the question. How can I forgive when I am not religious or don't believe in God? So perhaps they feel like maybe that's been a crutch that they're not, they don't think that they can forgive because they don't believe in God. I don't know.
For a lot of us, we do associate things with a religious structure. And in the Catholic Church, we have this whole notion of the sacrament of reconciliation. It was sometimes called the sacrament of penance, the sacrament of confession, the sacrament of healing, the sacrament of forgiveness. And even our Catholic catechism says there is no right name for this. It is any of those things. So it might be that they're talking about the notion of forgiveness as being a sacramental structure of a church. And if they're not a part of a church or don't believe in how the Catholic Church's sense of how we relate to God is given to us through this a sacrament, which is basically an idea of sacramentalizing, making sacred our normal things like asking for forgiveness, giving forgiveness, receiving it, understanding it, inculcating it into our lives, that maybe the listener is saying that it does it have to be done within that structure. My response would be no. I think forgiveness is a human thing, a human characteristic, a human virtue, and not so much a religious virtue or component of what it means to be a member of any particular church.
Well, I think we're gonna wrap up episode 1 here. This is a good place to jump off, and we're gonna come back. And I would like to tee up in episode 2 a little bit more about how religion looks at this topic and what we're learning from that, and then how we relate that to our everyday life.
Sounds great. Thanks, Robert. Thank you, Kelly. This is
All right,
wonderful.
Father Don, thank you for being here. We're looking forward to episode 2. And for you listeners, feel free to email or text in your questions, and we'll give you where to do that here at Time for Forgiveness. But again, this is our inaugural first episode of Time for Forgiveness, and we're just grateful for the opportunity to be here with you and really get into these questions, because as we discuss these things, we're opening our mind just like we're asking you to open your mind and really perceive more and judge less. And when we open our minds to God, call it whatever you want. Call it spirit, call it the universe. I like to call it God. But when we open our mind and ask the right questions and we perceive those answers, right? I like to think of intuition as God talking to us. And when we open our minds prayer is us talking to God, but we all have intuition, and God's talking to us and through us. I believe that. And sometimes because of, horrific things that are just unimaginable that come into our life, we experience one of those that just rock your foundation to its very core. We can easily, it is natural, maybe not natural, but it's common to shut down and to go inward. And so that's what we're trying to shine the light on, how to come out of those dark ages and those dark places. So thank you for being with us. And we look forward to joining you again here and being with you on episode 2 of Time for Forgiveness. Until then, have a great day.